Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for providing me with this opportunity to present to the symposium Muslim Minorities and Workplace Diversity and International Perspective. I'm making this presentation on behalf of Professor Edwina of Auckland University of Technology, New Zealand, and myself. So the paper which I'm presenting this morning is on diversity within Islam and its implications for management and organizations. Here is a brief outline of my presentation. First, I will explain the aims and rationale of this paper, which I would be presenting. Our key argument is this, that Islam is not a monolith, and there is a need to differentiate between the several variants of Islam and Muslims. We would also like to highlight that there are currently simplistic binaries which prevail in the mainstream media and academic scholarship, such as the Sunni versus Shia binary or the Arab versus non-Arab binary. And these binaries are somewhat misleading and simplistic, and they have to be problematized. We discussed the further nuances of differences within Muslims based on religion, denomination, sect, ethnicity, language, gender, and so on and so forth. And we also highlight implications of these variations for organizational practices such as diversity and inclusion, security concerns, and consequently the career prospects of Muslim employees. We also outline an agenda for future research. So in terms of aims and rationale, while the mainstream academic literature and media use the words Islam and Muslims in a monolithic manner that implies internal homogeneity, we argue that the Islamic faith is subject to multiple interpretations, which in turn implies that there are multiple types of Muslims who all interpret the Islamic discourse based on their ideology, sect, ethnicity, gender, religiosity, and practice their own versions of the religion. Drawing on a review of literatures on Islam and Muslims from diverse fields such as religion, gender, diversity, and extremism, we present a taxonomy of different types of Muslims and highlight its implications for management, governance, and organizations. So we trace ideological sources of differences amongst different variants of Islam and analyze how certain doctrinal and jurisprudential associations may reflect in faith-based intolerance, acceptance or rejection of diversity, and extremism. Based on the argument of heterogeneity among the Islamic world, we argue that an attention to such heterogeneity can have implications in the field of management and organization studies. So the question which we pose to academic scholars as well as to participants in this symposium is Islam a monolith? In the mainstream academic literature, as we have already identified, the Islamic faith and Muslims, they are often presented as a monolithic religion. And Muslims, to some extent, Muslim clerics and scholars, they also have to be blamed for this sweeping generalization because of their emphasis on one Islamic ummah, one Islamic fraternity, which is an idealistic position, although it doesn't really match with the realities of actual life. So this monolith is often neglected, ignoring the internal diversity on the basis of denomination, ethnicity, sect, and religious practice. Indeed, there are two broad sects within Islam, that is Sunni and Shia, but the diversity within Islam is much more nuanced and heterogeneous and can be traced to different interpretations of the text. Even within Sunni and Shia Islam, we come across different varieties based on opinions of narrators, jurisprudence, and different milieus where such interpretations are enacted and practiced. So, thus, for example, interpretations, geographical location, and culture, they intersect in how certain gender practices, such as a veil or hijab, and gender segregation, as well as injunctions on other matters such as inheritance, commerce, leadership, and treatment of religious and ethnic minorities, they are proclaimed, legislated, or endorsed. So scholars have highlighted the need for research on different understandings of Islam, which has been recognized because researchers have pointed out monoliths as Islamic perspectives rather than the Islamic perspective. Wali Nasser in 2007 explains the different versions of Islam by first introducing the divide between the Sunni and Shia sects of Islam as somewhat parallel to the divide between the Catholic and Protestant sects in Christianity, which have their origins in the initial days of the religion and each claiming historical orthodoxy. However, to add nuance to the simplistic Sunni-Shia binary, Nasser states that the two largest sects, which is Sunni and Shia, are not monolithic communities, and the followers of both sects are further divided into smaller subsects based on doctrine and/or jurisprudence, and are also diverse on grounds of geography, culture, language, ethnicity, and class. So, what exactly are the implications? Let me first also give you some examples of this heterogeneity within Sunni and Shia Muslims. So, for example, we know that the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, predominantly they represent Salafi or Wahhabi tradition within Sunni Islam. But the Salafi or Wahhabi tradition within Sunni Islam represents a tiny minority within Sunni Islam, perhaps not representing more than 5% of the global Sunni Muslim population. The majority of Muslims, with the majority of Sunni Muslims, they represent either Hanafi or Maliki or Shafi traditions. Similarly, within Shia Islam, the majority tradition is called Jafari or Isna Ashari or Imami, which prevails in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, parts of Kuwait, and also Bahrain, Azerbaijan. But then there are other variances of Shias as well. So, for example, in Yemen, the majority of Shias in Yemen, they happen to be Zaydi Shias. So, what exactly are the implications of this heterogeneity within Islam, within Sunni and Shia Muslims, as well as other denominations of Islam for management and organizations, for governance? So, multinational corporations may need to understand that in their international operations in the Middle East and other Muslim majority countries, regions, and communities, they are interacting with diverse ideologies. So, thus, for example, once again, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE, MNCs are likely to be dealing with Salafi and Hanbali ideology of the state, while in their operations in Egypt, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Turkey, it is likely to be Sunni Hanafi ideology. Clearly, we can see that there are more restrictions in the Salafi-dominated Saudi Arabia in terms of women's mobility and employment, vis-a-vis, for example, Sunni Hanafi dominated Turkey. Similarly, in their operations in Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and the northern part of Yemen, MNCs are dealing with the Shia, Jafari or Zaydi ideology, whereas in Indonesia and Malaysia, they mainly encounter Shafi ideology, and in North Africa, they are mostly faced with the Maliki ideology. So, when Muslims travel from their source countries to immigrate or work in Western countries, or typically non Muslim majority countries, they carry with them their traditions and ways of being, not only into the receiving country societies, but also into the organizations located in these countries. Add to this the influx of refugees into Europe, many of whom are Muslims from countries such as Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia, and the complexity of the management and diversity of a workforce within an organization increases exponentially. So while Salafis borrow their beliefs from Ibn Taymiyyah or his student Ibn Qayyim, who were followers of the Hanbali school, their doctrines are different as they do not follow a specific school of jurisprudence, mazhab or fiqh, and are more literal and puritanical, and happen to be more strict when it comes to rights of women and ethnic and religious minorities. So while individual practices may vary, generally puritanical and literal streaks and intolerance of religious and gender diversity are known attributes of hardline sections within Salafi Wahhabi and Devbandi communities. In the West, these attributes are evident in the communities affiliated or exposed to Saudi, Emirati, or Qatari funded mosques, seminaries, or literature. This in turn leads to ghettoization and isolation of these communities and individuals from the mainstream society, and strict rules of gender segregation and female seclusion, they are evident. Also, organizations may not realize the important differences within Muslim communities with respect to practices of gender segregation, female seclusion, female circumcision, and approaches to ethnic and religious diversity. This is clearly evident, for example, in relatively less restrictions on women's mobility and employment in the Hanafi dominated Turkey and Pakistan as compared to the Salafi or Wahhabi dominated Saudi Arabia. So, based on this cursory overview of and attention to internal heterogeneity of Islam, what exactly is our agenda for future research? We have sought through this paper, through this presentation, to introduce the concept of heterogeneity within Islam to organization studies literature. Thus, several examples which have been cited here, some of them are empirical and some of them are anecdotal. Future researchers may conduct detailed empirical investigation, both quantitative and qualitative, of Muslims of various types and the implication of such diversity for organizations, employment, and societies. There is also need for ethnographic studies that investigate the psychological patterns and work habits that underlie violence inside and outside the workplace, violence and intolerance. A good start could be through an analysis of those extremist discourses and tenets that underlie their individual and collective attitudes and practices, which are evident in the shape of ghettoization, intolerance, and violence by certain Muslim groups and communities in recent years. Now we are open to some questions and answers. Thank you for your time.